good evening to you. What a pleasure it is to entertain guests this evening. Why, in this past year, since the President's death, I have entertained very little. It seems that I spend most of my time reading letters of condolence. I have received thousands of letters from all over the world. Some of the letters I have received were from folks who knew the President or who had met him. They spoke of his kindness, his compassion, his intelligence, his wit. But most of the letters I have received are from folks who never actually met the President. But they, too, speak of his virtues. There are some letters that I have received that might be construed as being painful. You see, it is one thing to criticize the administration of a president, but to make personal attacks upon himself and his family, that is most painful for me. I have been told by friends that any woman who finds herself in the position of being married to the President of the United States will receive such letters. I'd like to share a letter with you that I received from a lady in Cedar Bluff, Iowa. It seems that at some point the lady changes her direction or perhaps was interrupted. Well, let me read the letter to you. Dear Mrs. President Wilson, I am writing to you about my son, Harold. My boy was a young fella any mother would be proud of. He was tall and good-looking, worked hard, and was a good sportsman, too. Your husband sent him over to France to die. I don't even know where my boy lays. I will never be able to go there. When I heard of Mr. Wilson's death, I was glad. I hope he suffered long and hard. He was sneaky and he lied to us. It's a good thing he's dead and can't do no more harm to boys like my Harold. You don't know what it is to lose a child. You are not a mother. And it is at this point that the direction seems to change a bit. No one can bring my boy back. I've been thinking about Mr. Wilson and my boy. I'm sorry you are alone now. I guess my boy and Mr. Wilson both gave their lives for the country. I am sorry. Can you please forgive me? Sincerely, Mrs. Harold Dawes, Sr. Oh, most assuredly, Mrs. Dawes, I can forgive you. And she is so very right. Her dear boy, Harold, and my Woodrow both gave their lives for the country. You know, there are times when I have to pinch myself so that I can remind myself who I am and where I am. You see, I started life in what you might call abject poverty. I was born in the hill country of Virginia, between Sperryville and Wytheville, Virginia. My father, John Bolin, was a minor court judge there. However, his income never covered all 11 children. You see, before the Civil War, the War of Northern Aggression. The Boland family was part of the landed gentry. We owned hundreds of acres of fine farmland, many magnificent houses, horses, other livestock. But after that war, all due to unscrupulous Yankee land grabbers, the Boland family was reduced to a few measly hard rock acres, a broken down farmhouse, and not much else. At one point in time, things became so desperate for my family, my father had to move the entire family to the upper level of the farmhouse so that he could rent the lower half out to get some cash. Oh, but my grandmother Boland, she refused to believe that we were still not members of that landed gentry. Most of my education was done at the knee of my grandmother Boland. She spoke French to us. She read poetry to us. She taught us how to set a proper table for tea, and not much else. Well, as I say, my dear father, who incidentally could trace his lineage back all the way to Pocahontas. Fat lot of good it ever did him. Well, as I say, my poor father, we were in hard straits. I was coming just past my 18th birthday, and my mother heavily suggested to me that I might go on out and find some gainful employment to ease the family financial situation. My father was thinking in the same vein, but his take on it was just a mite different. My father decided that I would do much better if I was sent up to Washington. You see, my older sister, Margaret, why, she had recently married, and her new husband was attached to the Treasury there in Washington. So my father thought my prospects would be much greater there in Washington. So one day, in the spring, just after my 18th birthday, Papa took me down to the train depot. I was wearing my best dress. Well, it was my only dress. I had all my worldly belongings in a little cardboard suitcase. As I boarded the train, Papa gave me $2 in case I needed anything along the way. Later that day, I landed at my sister's house there in Washington. After 2 or 3 days of settling in, my sister heavily suggested that I might go out and find some gainful employment. Well, that morning, there I sat with a newspaper in front of me and a pencil encircling all the possibilities. And off I went to find that gainful employment. Oh, I applied for everything. Nurse, laundress, school teacher, cashier, maid, none of which I was actually qualified for. It was on the 3rd day of my search, getting on toward evening, the close of the business day. I found myself walking down this elegant street where all the best shops in Washington were, and all the best people in Washington shopped there. I found myself in front of a jewelry store. There were 3 magnificently dressed windows showing off all the very best silver and china and jewelry. And for some reason, I entered that jewelry store. I walked across this plush, cobalt blue carpeting, and in the center of the store was a large, round glass display case, and oh, all of the best jewelry was on display there. And there I stood, staring. And then I realized I was being watched. I looked up, and just across from me was an older gentleman. Of course, when you're barely 18, any gentleman with a little gray is an older gentleman. Oh, he was beautifully and elegantly attired. Pinstripe trousers and a frock coat, and a huge diamond stick pin in his cravat. He smiled at me and walked around and asked, "Young lady, is there something in the case that you would like to see?" Well, all he had to do was look at me and realize I couldn't afford anything in that case. I sheepishly replied, "Oh, no, sir, I'm just browsing." He came a bit closer. He touched my elbow gently and he said, "Young lady, have you eaten anything today?" I said, "Well, you see, sir, I have been so busy searching for employment that I just didn't have time." Well, the truth of the matter was I had no money. Well, he said, "In the rear of our store, we have a little tea room for the ladies to take refreshment. Perhaps I could accompany you there, and perhaps you'd be refreshed with some tea and a sandwich." Suddenly, I found myself floating across that cobalt blue carpeting into this little alcove, which was papered in the most beautiful silk damask, cobalt blue wallpaper. And there were all these little round tables set with little gold chairs, and there were ladies seated at these little tables, nibbling sandwiches and sipping tea and waving their diamonds at one another. Well, I sat down with a gentleman. He must have caught sight of that newspaper that I had in my hand. He said, "Young lady, I do not believe I caught your name." I swallowed hard and I introduced myself. "Bowling, Edith Bowling, Edith Bowling, Sperryville, Virginia." He said, "Well, Miss Bowling, I'm very pleased to meet you. I'm Mr. Norman P. Galt, Jr. This is my jewelry store." Oh, I nibbled the sandwich, and he looked across at me and he said, "You've been looking for employment, is that what I understand?" I said, "Yes, sir. I've been searching for 3 days. I really haven't had much luck, but I'm sure that something will come up soon." And then he looked at me again and he said, "Do you have any experience in the retail sector?" Well, he could have asked if I knew how to run a locomotive. I had no experience in any sector whatsoever. Well, I responded, "Well, sir, I don't have experience, but I'm very quick and eager to learn." He said, "You know, Miss Bowling, we just might have a position for you here at the jewelry store." And then the gentleman snapped his fingers. The young lady came out again with more sandwiches and tea. And he whispered to her that his carriage should be brought round. He was going to accompany Miss Bowling home. He asked if I minded being accompanied home, and I said, "Well, I'm perfectly happy. I can walk to my sister's house." He said, "Oh, no. I will not have a young lady walking the streets here in Washington. No, I shall accompany you home." Well, that afternoon, as we drove to my sister's house, we chatted, and he told me that the following morning the manager would be there. He'd be alerted that Miss Bowling would be starting at the jewelry store, that I should be there promptly at 8 o'clock. I agreed I would most certainly be there very promptly at 8 o'clock. He walked me to the door and said, "Good afternoon." Of course, in this time, my sister and brother-in-law peeking out through the lace curtains. The moment I walked into the house, my brother-in-law said, "Who was that man, Edith?" And I replied, "That is my new employer, Mr. Norman P. Galt, Jr. of the Galt Jewelry Store." I must go to bed very early tonight. I have a whole day's work to do tomorrow. My sister looked at me and she said, Edith, what did you do? I said, I have found myself employment. Well, that next morning I was there bright and early before 8 o'clock, and then all the other employees began to gather there at the storefront, and the guard came out and he removed all the grates and the gates and so on from the windows and the door, and everyone rushed into their positions, and there I stood in the middle of the store. Very handsome gentleman, well-dressed, came over to me, introduced himself as the manager of the store. And he said, Miss Boland, you will be at the case in the rear of the store where we sell the cheapest jewelry. Well, I was determined to make a very good show of it. Well, by the end of that first business day, I had sold more jewelry at that case than in the history of that old jewelry store. And that afternoon at the close of business, the manager came over and he was looking at my receipts, and his first question, Miss Boland, what did you do? I replied, well, you see, sir, the gentleman would come up to my counter looking for a gift for a friend, and perhaps a little something for their wife. And so I would take the most expensive pieces out, and finally they would settle on 2 of the most expensive pieces. And that's all I had to do, sir. He said, well, you keep up the good work. Well, several months passed. I think it was about 6 or 7 months, and one afternoon at the close of business, Mr. Galt came to me and said, Miss Bowling, I would like to speak to you in the alcove before you leave this evening. And I thought, oh, if your employer wants you to come to a meeting privately at the end of the business day, that can't be good. Well, we sat there for a moment, and Mr. Galt cleared his throat, and he said, Miss Bowling, I was wondering if you would be interested in having dinner with me this evening and attending the opera. And I smiled. I was taken aback somewhat, and I said, well, I've never been to an opera, but I'm willing to give it a try. Well, that evening, we had a wonderful dinner, and then we attended the opera. It was in one of the best restaurants. I'd never been in such a place. Well, that evening, Mr. Galt took me home, and the next morning I could hardly wait to tell him what a wonderful time I had had that evening. And then the manager told me that Mr. Galt would not be in for a couple of weeks. He was vacationing at his country home in Virginia. Before too long, Mr. Galt and I became regulars at the finest restaurants in Washington. Regulars at the ballet, theater, opera. And 2 years had passed. And again, one afternoon, Mr. Galt asked if I would please come to the rear of the store at close of business. He paced back and forth for a few moments, and finally he sat down. He pulled the chair a little closer to me. He said, Edith, I have admired you from the very first day when you walked into my store. I realize that I am more than twice your age. And he paused. And then from his vest pocket, he withdrew a ring box, that cobalt blue velvet box. He pushed it across the table. He said, open it, Edith. It was the biggest diamond I'd ever seen. And then he took my hand and said, Edith, would you please do me the honor of becoming Mrs. Norman P. Galt, Jr.? I said, yes, Mr. Galt. He said, Norman. Yes, Norman, I would be most honored to become Mrs. Galt. Well, we had a lovely wedding there at Mr. Galt's, Norman's country house. My whole family came. And then we went on a one-year honeymoon to Paris. And immediately when we arrived in Paris, Norman said, Edith, I want you to buy everything and anything your heart desires. And I always listened to Norman. Oh, it was a wonderful year, but we did have to return to Washington and to the jewelry store. Now the problem, you see, the problem was that I had gained a husband, but I lost my employment. Norman did not think it was appropriate for his wife to be seen behind a counter at his jewelry store. And so I busied myself with committees and the women's club and, committees for the orphanage and for the hospital and for the ballet and on and on. And then one day, I had something very special to tell Norman. We were expecting a child. When I told him, he just stood there, tears streaming down his face. He said, I thought at this point in my life that I would never have a child. I don't care if it's a boy or a girl. He was so excited. But sadly, the pregnancy would be very difficult for me. I was on bed rest almost constantly. The doctors warning me that the child might be born very early, and that would make it most difficult for the baby. And then one morning, our little one arrived, and it was very early. Oh, she was so very tiny. Her skin was translucent. We named her Charlotte. Oh, Norman, he just stood there staring at her and smiling and staring. She only lived 3 days. Soon after her death, things between Norman and I changed. There were times when he would stay at the jewelry store very late. There were other times when he did not come home at all. And then one day he told me that he was going to take an apartment, a flat near the jewelry store. He said it would be easier for him to be closer to the store. He never asked me to go to any more of the buying trips. And sometimes he wouldn't come home for 2 weeks or so. But that one day, he had been very tired, and he said he decided that he would come home and rest somewhat better at home rather than alone in that apartment. We had a lovely dinner that evening. It seemed as though we were perhaps getting closer. The next morning, he said he still wasn't feeling very well. He was very tired. I told him, you don't have to go into the store. Please stay home. I would be delighted to stay with you all day and look after you. He said no. He had to get to the store. He had an important meeting with some buyers, and he couldn't miss the meeting. He went into the front hallway just to pick up his hat and his walking stick, and then he sat down very suddenly. He looked at me. He said, Edith, I think you should fetch a doctor. I had one of the maids run down to, I think it was just 2 or 3 houses from us. There was a physician there, and She brought him back, but it was too late. He'd had a heart attack. Norman was gone. I was a widow now, the richest woman in Washington. Again, I busied myself with various committees, but I did darken the doorway frequently of the jewelry store. And then one morning, it was early in March of 1915, I received a call from a friend of mine, Mrs. Bones, Helen Bones. She was a cousin to the president, to Mr. Wilson. She asked if I would like to come and play bridge that afternoon. Apparently the president had planned on playing golf, but the weather did not cooperate. And so I said, well, yes, I'd love to. I'd been to the White House, but I'd never actually met the president. I was quite excited. When I arrived there, I recall I can't recall the fourth person who was there. But let me see. I was seated here. The president was to my right. Helen was across from me. We had a lovely afternoon and played bridge. And while we were playing bridge, I noticed that something kept pushing and pushing on my leg. And I was trying to remember if there was a cat or a dog in the room when I had entered, and I did not recall that. And it seemed the further I moved, why, that pressure just continued on my leg. And then I looked over at the president. He was holding his cards in his right hand, and his left hand was under the table. And every time I moved, his hand followed me. Well, that afternoon, he walked me to the door there at the White House. He asked, Mrs. Galt, would it be all right if I call upon you? I reminded him, sir, it is inappropriate for the president to call on a private citizen. May I call on you? He smiled and he said, well, yes, most certainly. But may I telephone you? And I agreed, yes, most certainly. I no sooner walked into my house when the maid came running saying, the president is on the phone. He wants to talk to you. And so began our phone conversations, sometimes late into the night. Woodrow had a private line installed from the White House to my house so that our conversations could not be interfered with. And then one morning I received a call from Woodrow. He wanted to know if I could please come to dinner that evening at the White House. Well, I assumed it was some sort of an occasion, and I arrived at the appointed time. When I entered the state dining room, I realized the whole room had been emptied out, except for one small table in the center with 2 chairs, and the table was set for 2. Behind the draperies was the Marine Band. We had a lovely dinner that evening, and oh, we danced all evening. Woodrow was a wonderful dancer. His daughters had taught him all the very latest steps, the Continental, the Charleston. Oh, he was a wonderful dancer, and he had some special tunes that he enjoyed. Oh, You Great Big Beautiful Doll was one of his favorites, and Frankie and Johnny. Oh, he was such a wonderful dancer. Well, it was growing very late. I rose and I thanked Mr. Wilson, and before I knew what happened to me, there he was, kneeling on the floor in front of me, kissing the hem of my gown and saying, Edith, marry me tonight. I said, Woodrow, I am not marrying you tonight or any other night. He said, you've got to marry me tonight. I said, have you spoken to your daughters about this? He said, you're not marrying my daughters, you're marrying me. And I reminded him that his dear wife Ellen had passed away only a few months before, August of 1914. It was really inappropriate that he'd even think of asking. He begged me, though. He said, I will be very insistent until you say yes. Well, in June of that year, he invited me to go on a 2-week vacation with him to New England, fishing. I had always fished with my brother, so I enjoyed it. And while we were on that vacation, I learned to ride a bicycle. And it was on that vacation that you might say our romance was cemented. Well, when we came back to Washington, we were indeed the talk of the town. Every tongue in Washington was wagging about Mrs. Galt and the president. There were all of these drawings and cartoons in the newspapers. Oh, Woodrow had a favorite joke that they were telling at all the parties in Washington. Let me see. There was a large brown leather sofa that was in the hallway just outside the door of the president's office. And one morning, 2 of the butlers were instructed to move that sofa into the president's office. And one butler asked the other, he said, "Why does the president want this sofa in his office?" The other butler replied, "Because the top of the desk is too hard on Mrs. Galt's back." Well, he enjoyed that one so much. Well, he finally convinced me. He convinced me to marry him. We married in December 1915. He wanted to have this wedding at the White House. I said, "Woodrow, that is inappropriate. I am not a new bride. That should be something reserved for your daughters." We finally settled on the fact that we would marry at my house. All morning into the afternoon, right up to the last moment of the ceremony, these vans kept delivering bouquets of flowers, all with the same note attached. "With all my love, W.W." Just moments before the ceremony, one last van arrived with a corsage of orchids, a note, "Only you could wear orchids. Love, W.W." Well, that evening, after a little reception, we left for our honeymoon to the Ozarks. I was in the compartment changing, and I heard someone in the corridor singing. I looked out the door, and there was the president in his robe and pajamas dancing up and down the corridor singing, "Oh, you great big beautiful doll." Well, those 2 weeks just went by so quickly. On the 1st of January of 1916, I was introduced to the American public as the new First Lady. And then it was springtime. Baseball season. Oh, I loved to play baseball with my brothers, and I was very good. Well, this particular time, the president was going to throw out the first ball of the season. The stadium was filled. And as the president stepped up with that ball in his hand, he acted as though he was going to crush it if he held it too tightly. Well, he stepped up, and there was absolute silence throughout the whole stadium. And then he got down into this peculiar little position, and he threw out the ball. There was silence except for me. I burst into a loud laugh. I would say, "Woodrow, you throw just like a girl." He turned to me and he said, "Well, you should know, Edith, you taught me." Oh, I still love baseball to this very day. Well, things were getting difficult in the world. War had started in Europe. Woodrow feared that any day he'd be swept into that European conflict. And then there were the suffragists, marching back and forth in front of the White House every day with their placards and wearing their banners and shouting at the president. You see, I do not see any reason why a woman must have the vote. Surely any good wife worth her salt would be able to convince her husband who we should vote for. She needn't soil her hands on such a duty as voting. But oh, they kept shouting and marching and sometimes chaining themselves to the fence around the White House. But we knew that that war was coming to America. I remember when two prominent women came and stayed there at the White House. Miss Helen Keller, the philanthropist, and Miss Jane Addams from Chicago, social activist. And they came, stayed there 3 days at the White House, talking to the president, trying to convince him to keep America out of the war. I made a nuisance of myself with Miss Keller. I couldn't get enough of her. I followed her every step of the way. Every time she sat down, I sat right next to her. Anything she asked for, I'd have it there before she was finished asking. I couldn't get enough of her. She was so amazing. Just to be in the same room with her, I was filled with such peace and a feeling of happiness whenever I was in the room with her. She saw herself as a very lucky woman. Brilliant, brilliant woman. But sadly, we would be involved in that war. I remember when it finally came, I watched from the window of the White House as hundreds, thousands of those young men walked by, marching, their new uniforms, they're so ramrod straight. And they shouted, "Mr. Wilson, we're going over there, and we're going to finish it, and we'll be back by Christmas." And I thought, we are sending a whole generation of young men. We are sending them out to die. We are losing that whole generation of doctors and philosophers, writers, poets, artists. We're losing them all. I did my very best for the war effort. Couldn't find anyone to cut the grass there at the White House, and so I solved the problem by buying some sheep. Put them out there on the lawn. They kept it nicely trimmed, and when we had them sheared, we raised almost $100,000 for the Soldiers Fund. And I spent hours in the hospitals, going from bedside to bedside, sometimes helping whenever I could. But oh, I saw those maimed bodies and spirits. I saw one young man just sitting in the middle of his bed and holding his arms round him and just shaking uncontrollably and mumbling and shaking. The doctors called it shell shock. They said there was nothing they could do for him. There were times when I was overwhelmed by what I saw, what I heard. I discovered that there was a large oak tree on the grounds of the hospital. I discovered that if I went out and I stood behind that tree, nobody could see me from the hospital. And I would go there and I would scream and I would cry and I would pound on that tree. And then when I had regained my composure, I'd come back to the hospital. I even bought a brand new sewing machine, had it upstairs at the White House, and made pajamas and so on for the young men at the hospital. I did everything I could. Well, the war would come to an end. An armistice would be declared. The 11th month, on the 11th day, at the 11th hour of 1918, hostilities would cease. And then Woodrow and I would journey to Paris for the peace treaty talks at Versailles. Every night since we had married, he would come into the bedroom laughing and smiling and singing that silly song. But there in Paris, he was so worn from the day. He would sit there at the edge of the bed, his head in his hands, and he would weep. He would say, "They don't want to listen. They want these harsh reparations against the German people. If they do this, they demand this, these payments, it's just going to make the German people angry, and they will begin another war. They won't listen." He would not give up on his 14 points for peace. He would not give up the concept of a League of Nations in which nations would not go to war, but they would sit down and hammer out their difficulties. There were times he'd throw himself onto the bed and weep until he'd fall asleep. Finally, we'd be coming back home to America. When we came back home, Woodrow insisted that we take this train trip crisscrossing America so that he could introduce the treaty to the American people, to make them understand how important it was, and to tell them about that League of Nations that he was so intent on. He was exhausted, frail. He would stop everywhere. We would stop in cities, small towns, just sidings in little farm towns. No matter what the weather, he would stand out there and he would talk to whomever would listen, whomever would come forward, and he would tell them about the importance of that treaty and the importance of peace. He became so very ill. One morning he woke up and he said he was suffering from a very, very serious headache, and the pain was very severe in his neck and his arm. In no time at all, the doctor realized that Woodrow had had a stroke. He was paralyzed on his left side. He could not see from his left eye, could not hear on that side. He couldn't move. He could do nothing on his own. Every care had been given him. Dr. Clark told me, "You are the gatekeeper. You must not allow the president to ever become upset. It most certainly will bring on another stroke that would be his end." I took that position as the gatekeeper. I took it very seriously. I would not let that evil little Colonel House, he always hated me, an advisor to the president. House hates me to this day. He was always jealous of me because I was closer to the president than he. And I wouldn't allow that evil Henry Cabot Lodge to even come near the president. The mere mention of his name, and Woodrow would begin weeping and shaking. Every piece of paper that came there to the president's attention, I filtered it. I read everything to him. There were times I had to explain it to him. But I never signed the president's name to any legal document. There are still to this day people who are accusing me that I was there signing the president's name. I insist. You did not have a petticoat government here in America. There were many who were more capable than I who ran the government. He may have been the President of the United States, but first and foremost, he was my husband. And I would do anything and everything to protect him. Finally, though, it was 1920, election year. My dear Woodrow, he commented, "Well, I hope they can find some other fool to take the job." Well, they found another fool. Fellow from Canton, Ohio, by the name of Warren G. Harding. The day of Harding's inauguration, Woodrow was not feeling up to the traditional meeting of the two presidents, the tea and coffee. He sent a message to Mr. Harding that he simply wasn't feeling up to it. We left that inauguration day of 1921. We left by the back door of the White House. The whole staff lined up to say farewell to us. I drove to our house there on S Street. It was a house, it was a gift from friends, our little retirement home. Woodrow always liked it when I drove. However, I do not understand. Perhaps you have seen these in your town. Here in Washington, they've put these things in called stoplights. I see no reason for them. I'm perfectly capable of seeing if there's anybody coming in the other direction. So I just persist, drive right through them. I see no reason to even stop. It's just pure waste of money and nonsense. Oh, but when we would drive around Washington, why, folks would wave and cheer. "How are you, Mr. Wilson?" And he'd wave and smile. He was so happy that they still remembered him. But in February, he would tire so easily. And beginning of February, he was so weak and frail. It was on a Sunday morning. February 6th, 1924. Woodrow woke with a headache. He was running a bit of a fever. Doctor came immediately. Just a short time later, Woodrow lost consciousness. He'd had another stroke. Before the morning was through, my husband, Thomas Woodrow Wilson, 28th President of the United States, would fade into history. There have been times when I have envied Ellen, the president's first wife. They were so very young when they married. She gave him 3 beautiful daughters. She watched as he rose at Princeton to be the president of the university, governor of New Jersey, president of the United States. But I would not give up just one moment that I spent with him. Not one moment. As I say, I wouldn't give up what I experienced as being the First Lady. I've met so many interesting and wonderful and infamous folks along the way. I remember one fellow I was very fond of. He was the Secretary of the Navy, Josephus Daniels, very religious man. Most around the Navy Department called him Uncle Joe. Short little fella, sort of round around the edges. Sweet man, very religious. And you know, one day, he came to the White House to have a meeting with Woodrow, and he brought a young gentleman with him. I don't know if you'll recognize the name. This young man is from New York. His name is Franklin Roosevelt. And Joe brought him along. He was Joe's assistant secretary to the Navy, and they were leaving, and Woodrow and I were walking them to the door. We were standing out on the porch of the White House and chatting, and that young Mr. Roosevelt was standing there looking up at the house. And Joe whispered to Woodrow, "I think that young fella's after my job." Woodrow replied, "No, he's not, Joe. He's after mine." Oh, Joe, as I say, he was a very religious gentleman, and he found out that the sailors in his Navy were still receiving a ration of rum every day. And you know that whole prohibition thing, you know, that's been around. Well, he said, "No more rum from the sailors. From now on, they shall have a coffee instead." And so in all the ships of the American Navy, the young sailors would lift their heavy mugs, "A cup of Joe." Oh, Mr. Daniels. Yes, I have met so many folks along the way, and I have seen the suffering and the death of that war, the changes that it brought. Just recently, someone sent me this poem. It was written by Lieutenant Colonel John McCrae. He was a medical doctor attached to the Canadian Army during the Great War. It is entitled "In Flanders Fields." Dr. McCrae would lose his life just days before the armistice in 1918. In Flanders fields, the poppies blow, between the crosses, row on row, that mark our place. And in the sky, the lark still bravely singing, flies scarce, heard amid the guns below. We are the dead. Short days ago we lived, we felt dawn, we saw the sunset glow, we loved and we were loved, and now we lie in Flanders fields. Take up our quarrel with the foe, to you from failing hands we throw the torch. Be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders fields. Thank you. Thank you so very kindly. Thank you so very kindly. Thank you so very kindly. Thank you very kindly. Are there any questions that I might answer for you?
Could you repeat the question?
Oh, I shall. Yes, ma'am.
You didn't mention anything about the flu.
Oh, the influenza, yes. The lady asked about the flu, the influenza epidemic. It was tragic. There was just hundreds and thousands of young men, and for some reason we noticed that it was very virulent in young people, that it was the youngsters, the people who were just 16, 17, maybe about to 35 years of age are the ones who died or would become very sickened with it. The origin, at that time we did not know what the origin was. We had some very, very wonderful doctors who were working on it all over the world, trying to figure out what it was and where it came from and what they could do about it. And there really wasn't at that time much that we could do except give as much comfort as possible to those who were suffering. And it went sweeping through the training camps. It just would absolutely decimate an entire regiment of young men in a very short time. I think perhaps it was really almost the scourge that was just equal to the meat grinder that was killing all those young people in Europe. And there were some wonderful doctors who worked very hard to find the origin of it and to figure out what we could do. And then suddenly, just as strangely as it had been awakened, it disappeared. And one will never know. I did not mention one gentleman that I was very fond of, Mr. Herbert Hoover. He was put in charge of the food allotments that would be going to Europe. The people, especially in Belgium and in France and other areas in the Netherlands, were starving. And he was the one who organized everything and got all these folks food. And a wonderful gentleman, very conscientious, a wonderful administrator. Are there any other questions? Well, thank you.
You mentioned about the women's vote.
Yes, I did. Oh, they were marching in front of the White House.
But you didn't say that they finally got.
Oh, yes. They were so persistent and irritating. Finally, Mr. Woodrow Wilson would sign that evil paper. And to this day, I see no reason to be voting. Were there any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Was Mrs. Wilson ever in Wisconsin? Did she visit here?
No. I'm going to leave Mrs. Wilson for a moment and just to answer that question. She asked if Mrs. Wilson ever came to Wisconsin. She did not travel the way they do, and the president didn't travel that much. It was really strange even that he went on that whole tour in 1919 going across the country, and that was a big deal. The presidents often they didn't do that. They didn't fly around, couldn't fly around. You know, the Wright brothers were busy all the time and they couldn't get them. But they didn't and first ladies did not often travel. It was a strange thing when she went, when Edith went with Mr. Wilson to France and then on that trip across the United States. Most of the time, first ladies didn't really do that. They stood to the right and 2 steps behind, which most first ladies don't obey that these days, but that's where you stand. To the right of the president, 2 steps behind. And he enters the room first because they're playing Hail to the Chief. So you don't come in first. Hello. That's Eleanor. Yes.
Was she not able to have children after?
No, she could not. They recommended, the lady asked if Edith would ever have any more children. No, they recommended that it simply would not. We don't know what the problem was. I've got my thoughts, but that's kind of gynecological in sense. No, we won't go there. But no, they would not have any children. He had 3 daughters with his first wife, Ellen. He had 9 grandchildren, which he wouldn't see all of his grandchildren, but he would have 9 grandchildren. So he did have quite a large family. There was, yes, ma'am.
So you took a trip to Paris, right? And I'm from a suburb of Kansas City, so why the Ozarks in that day and age? He must have been an avid fisherman.
He was. She asked about the president being a fisherman. He was a very, very avid fisherman. And actually, Woodrow Wilson was a wonderful sportsman. This was kind of a running joke between the two of them. He was a killer tennis player. He was absolutely a killer, right up just, until he had his stroke. He was an absolute killer tennis player. He didn't like golf, but it was something he did because then he could get some of, maybe a couple of senators out there on the golf course, and if he didn't beat them with his golf club, he could convince them somehow to see things his way. His personality really changed after the death of his first wife, after his death of Ellen. His personality, he became rather sexually aggressive, which is why it was after poor little Edith. Oh, she wasn't expecting that. But his personality did change. He angered much faster. And there were times when he would burst into tears. Now they're looking at that, and they think there may have been a point not too long after his wife's death that he may have suffered a trans-ischemic attack, a TIA, which is like a little, they call them little strokes. There's no such animal. It's a stroke. And that may have changed his personality but you look at him in his photographs, with his, pinstripe pants and his top hat and everything. He was fun-loving. He was funny, wonderful dancer, loved modern music. He enjoyed company. He enjoyed people very much. So when we look at him, we don't think of him as being, this Don Juan fellow, which he was, and we don't think of him as being that outgoing, but he was he enjoyed people. Thank you so much. I hope that next time, I guess Eleanor is going to be somewhere soon. So perhaps you can come and meet Eleanor. She's a lovely lady, and she's got lots of Roosevelt stories too. Thank you so much. Thank you.